All right, greetings everybody, and welcome to a lecture that actually came by request. And it was one I was eventually going to do, but it's been kind of tucked away in my files, and I thought now was a really good time to be talking about the Spanish Civil War. Now, some of you might be going, the Spanish Civil War, there was a civil war in Spain, which would not entirely be unusual. The Spanish Civil War, oddly enough, oftentimes gets pushed to the periphery in any study of the years of appeasement, 1936 to 39. You notice the years of the Civil War happened right around the time that Britain and France were making concessions to Germany in hopes that their appetite would be satiated and a war could be averted. So, in many ways, I think the Spanish Civil War is, while it is not part of those appeasement discussions and negotiations, it's very much a part of the broad picture of appeasement. For a couple of things we have to consider, that during the Spanish Civil War, both the Germans, the Nazis, and the Italian fascists were invited to come and support the fight against republicanism, against communism, whatever term you want to use. And it was in Spain where many of the Nazi blitzkrieg tactics would be perfected. So it became kind of a testing ground, if you will, for their dive bombing tactics. When you look at the bombing of Guernica, Madrid. Guernica, of course, this painting here, was done by none other than Pablo Picasso as a reaction to the horror that was witnessed at the bombings of Guernica. So what I want to do today is just sort of talk about the Spanish Civil War in relation to that period, the Age of Appeasement, but also try to make sense of what was emerging very early on, sort of early signs of a Cold War, which really fires up after the end of 1945, at the end of World War II. But then it really does start just after the Russian Revolution. But in many ways, there's that piece that I associate with the Spanish Civil War as well. So much to talk about. So let's move on and get a little bit into the background. So how the Civil War starts is that it begins as a revolt of army commanders in Spanish Morocco, prompted by the resentment they felt at the growing social reforms administered by the Azana government, which was elected democratically. Now, what's interesting is that Spain's first experiment with democracy occurs in 1931, when the monarch finally succumbs to pressures of implementing sort of a constitutional type of system in government. And that government, or a form of it, is re-elected in 1936. It is a Popular Front government. Basically what that means, and there was a Popular Front government also in France, but in the case of Spain, what the Popular Front government was, which is democratically elected in 1936, was a broad coalition of political parties from the left and the right. I mean, anarchists were part of the Popular Front, communists were, Christian groups, conservatives, liberals, you name it. It was a broad, sweeping front of people that were interested in moving Spain forward. Now, obviously, those on the left of the Popular Front would have been more interested in seizing church property to get land to the peasants, and limiting the amount of money that is made available to the Spanish military, whatever it may be. But basically what happens is, regardless of the left and right paradigm within the Popular Front, most people in this government were really quite keen on land reform, because Spain had really fallen behind in economic development over the last couple of hundred years. But because the Spanish Catholic Church owned so much of that property, and you're essentially taking away church property to become part of your land reform program, that of course really gets the Catholic Church up in knots. In addition though, as I said earlier, the Azana government also implements reduction in monies available to expansion of Spain's military. And I think that's the piece that really prompts elements in the Spanish army to rebel, right? So it was the government's own army, although that army tended to be very conservative, very nationalistic, very right-wing in thinking, very anti-communist. So when that government is re-elected in 36 and land reforms continue, that's when there's this sort of lashing out. And one of the key figures in this movement was a fellow named Francisco Franco. He would lead the Spanish military forces against the new Republican democratically elected government. So we'll go back, 1931, King Alfonso XIII abdicates after municipal elections saw Republicans gain overwhelming successes. The new government was a coalition, liberal to left-wing parties that created many land reforms and attempted to reduce the influence of the Catholic Church. They weren't trying to eliminate it, they were just trying to eliminate the amount of power that the Church had through the control of land. Spanish generals particularly disliked Azana because he had cut the army's budget and closed the military academy while he was war minister in 1931. So the bad blood between the Popular Front Republican government and the Spanish military goes back. A reaction to these reforms created a group organized into a right-wing movement along the fascist model called the Falange. Okay, now the Falange is a uniquely Spanish spin on fascism. And I'm always a bit reluctant to use that term loosely because, of course, what we see happening is that conservative elements in the Catholic Church kind of come together with the military elements in the Spanish army who oppose the government to kind of try to undermine this democratically elected government. And, so the Falange is a uniquely Spanish form of fascism. All parties from the center to the far left joined together in a Popular Front government, which triumphed in the 1936 elections. Okay, so 1931 was the first democratic government, and the 1936 election saw a greater broad spectrum and a reaffirmation of the Spanish people's desire for some type of Republican democratic system, whether you were a communist or a liberal. In the summer of 1936, General Francisco Franco invaded Spain from Spanish Morocco. So this is a really interesting situation. When your own military attempts to overthrow the government, well, who's going to defend the government? If key elements in Spain's military are trying to overthrow it, well, then you've got to go to the grassroots. You've got to find people on the streets. You've got to find people within the Spanish army who are opposed to Franco's attempted coup d'etat to stand up. And there were elements in the Spanish army that were willing to defend the Republic. But at the time, it was pretty daunting. Things were not looking good for the Popular Front government. So who supported who in Spain? Well, Franco, the Spanish fascist leader, had support from the army, obviously, and he was one of the key figures in the army. Conservatives in the Catholic Church supported Franco because they didn't like land reform. They didn't like church property being nationalized and taken away. And for the most part, the middle and the upper classes. Now, the middle classes are interesting because if they had to pick between somebody who was going to claim to defend your property, the fascists, and those who claimed they were going to take it away, the communists, it seems like an oversimplification, but from a middle class perspective, it's not surprising that they would feel greater security under fascist leadership than a communist leadership, because under a communist leadership the fear was that all their property would be then taken away and equally distributed or whatever it may be. So oftentimes in the rise of fascist governments, we saw this in Germany and in Italy as well, the middle classes are kind of pushed to having to make a decision. And in most cases, they're going to, jump into bed with the fascists before they do the communists. So, the Republicans had support from agrarian elements, peasants, working people, industrial workers, and those basically very generally disenfranchised by poverty. So, pretty obvious where this is going. Spain became a center stage for an ideological conflict. What you see happening in Spain is very, very clear lines. You are either with us or against us. The Republican government, we have to keep in mind, they are democratically elected. And regardless of how US, Canada, Britain, France felt about the communist influence in this Popular Front government, because they were a significant element, they were still at the end of the day a democratically elected government. So in hindsight, that should have been their number one concern, was to support democracy in Spain, regardless of which elements are part of that system. The war was cast between Republican sympathizers as a struggle between tyranny and democracy. The propaganda campaign was remarkable in Spain. And by nationalist supporters as between communist and anarchist red hordes and Christian civilization. Oh my gosh, it's either us or them. You're going to burn in hell, or you're going to go to the kingdom of heaven. I mean, it's so typical when you get such a clash, an ideological clash between the left and the right. And in Spain really epitomizes that. And so many people were moved by events in Spain, whether it be George Orwell, or Ernest Hemingway, or Pablo Picasso. Many writers and authors became very kind of enraptured with this notion and became very sympathetic to the Republican cause. We saw a lot of people willing to go to Spain and defend the cause of republicanism, and willing to risk their lives. So, the Republicans received support from the USSR, shouldn't be surprising, and the fascists got it from Hitler and Mussolini. So that's how it becomes a very ideological civil war. So on the Republican side, there were socialists, there were liberals, communists, and anarchists. At the beginning, socialists and radicals supported democracy, while the communists and anarchists opposed the institution of the republic as much as the monarchists. This is ironic, that what the heck were the anarchists and communists doing in this broad Popular Front coalition? Well, I think the communists understood that, for them at the end of the day, their goal was a Marxist state. That was something that they wanted to achieve. If a temporary alliance with democratic forces would give them that opportunity down the road, then they would take it. The problem is that within this broad coalition, we see almost a civil war within a civil war develop between the anarchist elements and the communist elements, who spent so much time infighting that I think they did the broad Popular Front defense of Spain a great disservice, because they really, at the end of the day, were more concerned with their own ideological outlook than what was good for everyone else who was part of this broad coalition. There was great division amongst the left, and infighting occurred, as I said, between communists and anarchists, so that becomes very, very contentious. So who supports the Republicans? Here we go. These are the democratic forces. Republicans, also known as Spanish loyalists, received weapons and volunteers from the Soviet Union, right? Mexico, interestingly enough, and the International Socialist Movement, and also the International Brigades. Now we're going to talk about the International Brigades, because the Americans would send a group of volunteers, most of whom were kind of intellectuals and students, and I believe they were called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Each country would kind of send their own cohort. They were always volunteers. They were usually young people who were so distraught by the depression, the conditions they lived in, that going to Spain and fighting for democracy gave them a sense of purpose. They were fighting against fascism. They appeared to be supporting the forces of progress, whichever force that was for you, whether it be liberalism or communism. So I think in many ways, idealism is what really drives young people to go to volunteer in Spain. In total, the USSR provided Spain with 806 planes, 362 tanks, and 1,500 artillery pieces. Forces fighting on behalf of the Republicans received limited aid, but support was seriously hampered by the arms embargo declared by France and the UK. Okay, here we go. Britain and France had a very strict policy of what they called non-intervention. We will not intervene in the internal affairs of Spain's civil war, knowing full well that Italy and Germany were pounding Spain in their blitzkrieg formations and tactics, knowing full well that the USSR was sending crate loads of supplies and military supplies, and inevitably Soviet support and then fascist support leads to hundreds of thousands of deaths in Spain. But for Britain and France, we're not going to get involved. I mean, on one level, I can kind of understand why they didn't want to. Civil wars are always the worst kind of wars. Just ask the Americans. It's brother against brother. It's a horrible thing, because at the end of that civil war, you still have to live together, you still have to build together, and you have to move on together. And that can be a very, very hard thing to do. But for the British and French, the policy of non-intervention was almost an invitation to the Nazis. Oh, well, the British and French are not going to do anything, so let's go in there and pound Spain and see what happens. I mean, when you talk about, testing the waters, if you will, the Spanish Civil War is a huge, emboldens the fascists big time. And in fact, fascist Italy under Mussolini and Nazi Germany under Hitler, that's what brings them together, by the way. They had not been friends before 1936, but they come together with their mutual desire of suppressing communism in Spain. So, the League of Nations supported non-intervention, unfortunately, while fascist Italy and Germany pounded Spain. All right. A little bit of, and this is the MacPaps, or the Mackenzie-Papineau Battalion. The names Mackenzie and Papineau are named after two leaders of both the upper and lower Canadian rebellions of 1837. Now, just be aware that the conditions that brought Canadians to Spain were very similar to the conditions that brought American volunteers to Spain, or British volunteers, or French. So there are a lot of parallels here. So the MacPaps were the Canadian International Brigade. By summer of 1937, some 1,200 Canadians were involved in the conflict, and a separate battalion was formed for them in early May. I've seen numbers upwards of 1,600, by the way, so I'm going to say between 1,200 and 1,600 Canadians went to Spain. They traveled illegally to Spain and were largely persecuted upon their return. Okay. So what happens is the Canadian Communist Party, under the leadership of Tim Buck, becomes kind of the mobilization force behind recruiting men to Spain. So people would and you got to consider that for the young men that went to Spain, these are men that didn't have jobs. These are men who were largely single, who had nothing on the go, who were depressed and deprived of humanity because of the deprivations caused by the Great Depression. So when this opportunity came, it was probably a question of, well, I got nothing better going on here, and hey, maybe we'll go fight fascism in Spain. The problem was, many were recruited by the Communist Party, which was a problem in the eyes of the Canadian government, but the Canadian government forbid Canadians from going to Spain to fight. So these people, these young men, usually left on passports as tourists to France. And they would get to France, they would get into the border regions, of course, between, is it the Pyrenees, between Spain and France, and it was in there where many of them would receive their kit for the first time. And many of these young men were like young idealists. They were workers or farmers, and they never shot a gun before. So here they get knee-jerk training, and you know, when the Civil War is over and they all go back home, there are federal agents waiting for them at the ferry terminal saying, all right, you come with us, you know, and they get thrown in prison temporarily, because when World War II breaks out, the Canadian authorities go, oh my gosh, we just imprisoned these guys for voluntarily going to Spain to fight for fascism, and now we're fighting fascism again, so we're going to release you guys all from prison. You can go back to Europe, but this time you're fighting the Nazis. So oftentimes, those volunteers that went to Spain that ended up fighting in World War II as well were sometimes referred to as the premature anti-fascists. Interesting. Canadian contingent was almost wholly working class, who were driven to the left by the Depression, and hence the role of the Communist Party in mobilizing these young men. 721 of the 1,546 Canadians known to have fought in Spain. Well, that's more precise. See, I said between 12 and 1,600. That's a more precise number. Fought in Spain, lost their lives. Nearly 50% of Canadians who went. The Canadians who died in the Spanish Civil War are not included in the books of remembrance, the Peace Tower, and their sacrifice is not commemorated on federal war memorials or in Remembrance Day services. Those who survived the war are not entitled to veterans' benefits. Now, for some of you, it might be, well, that's a no-brainer. They fought in an illegal war. They left the country illegally. But I would argue that were they not absolved once we went to war against fascism in Europe? I mean, couldn't we at least say, well, you know what, maybe we didn't like it at the time, but they were right, that fascism was a menace. It needed to be confronted. But, you know, and I've spoken to many veterans who have had strong feelings about, negative feelings about these. In fact, many years ago in the late 90s, I won a book award in military history, and I was given the opportunity to go to the armories where, you know, all the vets hang out and have drinks on the weekends, and it's a lovely room, and I went to this thing to be given this award. It was quite intimidating. I was just, you know, 20-something-year-old kid who'd written this essay in military history. My essay was on the Canadians volunteers in Spain, and when I got there, you know, I was welcomed, and I was sitting at tables, and there was, you know, speeches, and then I got up and they accepted my award, and I sat back down, and it wasn't until after lunch, where we all kind of mingled after, where I got chatting to people, and then they'd ask me, well, by the way, we don't even know what you wrote your paper on, that you won the award for. And I said, well, yeah, I wrote my paper on the Canadian volunteers in Spain. And I never forget two of them looking at me going, oh, and what position did you take on that? At that point, I kind of, okay, yeah, I better be careful. And I can't remember, it was so many years ago, but I do remember doing a bit of a dance to be sure that I didn't offend anybody, because my position was that, you know, that their cause was just, and, you know, I was young, I was idealistic. I still feel the same way, although I've got a much more sort of balanced view of things, but I took a more sympathetic position to the Canadian volunteers in Spain, I guess would be the best way to put it. And I could pick up very quickly that veterans of World War II, many of whom just didn't feel kindly about these guys. So, kind of sad. And these veterans are often referred to as premature anti-fascists and have recently received recognition here in Victoria, British Columbia. If you go down to the Parliament buildings, you'll see this memorial was brought in the late 90s, and even having this commemoration was contentious. There were, you know, military groups or veterans organizations that said, we don't agree with this. Others said, well, you know what, yeah, maybe we didn't agree with it in '36, but, you know, in hindsight, they were on the right side of things. So, it's very interesting. All right. Here's some powerful propaganda. The imagery, of course, very almost socialist realism. No passaran, none shall not pass. So, I love this political cartoon. I'm hoping you can see it really clearly. So here you have a man lying on the ground being tackled by one fellow who is army fascism, and his legs are being held down by the fascist international. As I said, the guy on the ground is democracy. And here you have the British and the French standing off to the side saying, hey, I say fair play. You shouldn't encourage the aggressor, you know. After all, my friend and I are trying to help his victim. Done by the great, is it David Lowe? Yeah, he's done so many of these political cartoons. Political cartoons can send a very, very powerful message. And as a teacher, I use political cartoons all the time. This one I just think is wonderful. You know, just standing off to the side saying, hey, now you can't do that, and that's not right, but we're not willing to do anything ourselves. So, all right, we've spent quite a bit of time looking at the Republican side of things, and let's look at the nationalist side. So, the Nationalists, also called insurgents, rebels, or by their opponents, Francoists, or over-inclusively as fascists, fearing national fragmentation, opposed the separatist movements and were chiefly defined by their anti-communism. And that's why I have a bit of concern about lumping the Spanish Catholic Church as considering they were not fascists. I mean, that's ridiculous. But the Franco elements, the military elements, the Spanish Catholic Church, they were brought together by their mutual disdain of communism. It was really the communist elements and the reformist type of economic policies that were angering these organizations, especially when it was stripping them of their power, right? But they were chiefly defined by their anti-communism. Their leaders had a generally wealthier, more conservative, monarchist, landowning background, and they favored the centralization of state power. So they felt that everything was coming to pieces with this Republican government, and everything's falling apart. We're going to have red flags on our coast. We need to prevent. We do not want a communist beachhead on the western side of Europe. And for the Soviet Union, I mean, they're still a pariah state for the most part, and they're the only communist country during the Spanish Civil War, so they're looking for not only friends, but if there's a communist rebellion or a revolution somewhere, they're going to do what they can to prop that government up. So it shouldn't be surprising that the Soviets are getting involved here. The revolution in the Republican zone at the outset of the war, killing 7,000 clergy and thousands of lay people, drove Catholics, left then with little alternative to the Nationalists. So, there were atrocities on both sides, but once radical elements in the Republican government and renegade groups, bandits in the countryside, began executing church priests and clergymen, what do you think that's going to do to people that attend that church? They're going to be terrified of these red forces or red hordes or whatever. So, a lot of people are pushed to one side based on the atrocities committed by the other. If I were to witness Republican forces torturing and killing people, I'm going to want nothing to do with them. I'm going to go as far away from them as I can. I mean, we have to understand that people's motivation for taking sides in this kind of ugly civil war can oftentimes be determined by what they experience, what they see on the ground. And if they don't know what side they're on and they see an atrocity committed by one side, they're going to promptly go to the other. So, all right, so Francisco Franco asked Hitler from Nazi Germany and Mussolini from fascist Italy to aid the Nationalists. Portugal would also offer support for Franco. Both would send significant arms and soldiers. Germans would practice and master bombing tactics on Madrid and Guernica. That's where I talk about the notion that really early stages of blitzkrieg were developed on Spanish cities. Although the U.S. was officially neutral during the conflict, major American corporations such as Texaco, General Motors, Ford Motors, and the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company greatly assisted the nationalist rebels with their constant supply of trucks, tires, machine tools, and fuel. Now, why did they do this? Because they're fiercely anti-communist and pro-fascist? No, that's too easy, it's too simple to give that, make that argument. They're businesses. They're selling to people. If you want to buy it, we will sell it. Maybe these companies weren't really necessarily thinking about the nature of the governments or groups that were purchasing their products. I mean, we've seen this throughout history that capitalism can be quite blind, and if somebody wants to buy your product and they're doing nasty things with it, you don't want to know that, because all you want is to ensure that those people continue to buy your product. So, and I don't say this as a defense of these companies, but really I think at the end of the day that's what it came down to. The German forces numbered about 12,000 men, and as many as 19,000 Germans fought in Spain. More than 75,000 Italians. Look at that. That's a huge amount of Italians fought for the nationalists in Spain. So when you have 100,000 fascist forces from Italy and Germany coming to your country to help support your cause, that is a huge military lift, especially considering that the Republican side was getting nothing but a bunch of idealistic young men who were willing to fight, who had no military training. The Soviets were sending supplies, but there weren't Red Army soldiers on the ground, right? So as a result of this, I don't think the Republican forces really had much of a chance. Well, the fascist forces would win on the eve of World War II. It's kind of ironic that as this Civil War comes to an end, World War II is just about to begin. There's an interesting story that Hitler took a train ride from Berlin to Madrid with the sole purpose of talking to Franco about Spanish involvement in the war. And I guess when they met, Franco basically says, look, my country's in tatters. I support you in principle, but I can't get involved on the ground. I'll send some volunteers to the Soviet Union to fight the Soviets, but I don't want to send troops to fight the British or the French. So I think in many ways Franco was already kind of thinking beyond World War II, that he needed to make sure that he didn't take sides too clearly, because he wanted to ensure his own security when the war ends, and he wanted to be sure that regardless of who wins the war, he's going to be okay. Franco allowed Spanish soldiers to volunteer to fight in the German army against the USSR only, but forbade Spaniards to fight in the West against the democracies. Franco declined involvement in the war because his country needed to rebuild. Sorry, I got distracted with the story from Hitler. So Hitler comes to Madrid, says, look, so we gave you 3 years, we gave you, between us and the Italians, 100,000 troops, we gave you lots of advantage in warfare, and we just ask that you now help us out. And Franco said, no, I can't do it. And I guess Hitler was so angry when he left Madrid, he said that I would rather have my teeth pulled than to meet with Franco again. And, throughout the war, you got to remember, Spain was not involved in the Second World War, so they very carefully played kind of both sides as the war developed. Spain was a safe haven for all Jewish refugees, and anti-Semitism was not official policy under the Franco regime. In fact, hundreds of thousands of Jews fled out of Europe through Spain, and many hunkered down and hid and stayed in Spain. So in many ways you can make the argument that Franco kind of became a bit of a shelter for many European Jews fleeing Nazi horror. His resistance to directly supporting his fascist allies in the war would result in his staying in power until 1975. Now, when World War II ends, you might be thinking, how on earth could a fascist leader stay in power till 1975 after what we learned about fascism? Well, number one, he stayed out of the war, played his cards very carefully. Number two, when World War II ends, the Cold War begins almost immediately. So anti-communism becomes front and center of European politics, right? And I think that they were quickly forgiven for their past missteps and part of a broader sort of anti-communist coalition of nations who were just as concerned about the Soviet Union as they were. So, you know, the UN was not happy, of course, because a lot of people said, hey, you know what, maybe they didn't fight the war, but in principle they supported the Nazis. They would get entrance into the League of Nations, or the United Nations now rather, in the mid-1950s. But you look at that, I mean, Franco's in power till 1975. All right, and that is kind of an abridged, shortened summary of events in the Spanish Civil War. So for me, I believe that the Spanish Civil War is too often overlooked, and I think it's extremely important in that narrative of the events that lead up to World War II. So that being said, thank you very much for watching my lecture, and we look forward to see you again next time. Take care. Thank you.